we're gonna bang the elevator drum for a little while. I know a couple of y'all been through this already. I know there's been a lot of repetition. It's been done in the Dragon Eddy class and then the GFA, and now here we are again. There's been a lot of reps, but if you remember, like going through heavy lifting changes over the last couple of years, same drill, right? Train hard on the new tools for a while. Why are we here? We kind of edged to include some elevator stuff in with the rope CE, because DJ's plan was to do CE in an elevator shaft just to kind of freshen up on that environment. He needed to do that anyway. We figured we might as well couple this stuff there. The reason I'm personally here, or the reason I personally took an interest in the elevator stuff, is because I'm intimidated by them, and because I feel like I've kind of been doing stuff loosey-goosey for a long time, and I never really felt at home on our elevator progression. I like to compare it to forcible entry, and where we were 10 years ago with forcible entry. We weren't necessarily bad at it, but we were kind of disorganized at it. And you could show up to go to work with a guy and forcing a door, and you weren't sure where he was in a progression, what he had done. We didn't have words like gap set force, and we didn't make those up, right? We took some stuff we learned from elsewhere and we put it into practice. But now that's common terminology for us, right? And it helps us identify how we fit into a mix of a job that's already happening. So we wanted to kind of do the same thing with elevators and develop a progression. So we took that from the Mike Dragon Eddy class and then some past experience of crews here in town, kind of folded it together. And this sheet was made just for y'all's reference. Everybody's got one. Front side is Tim Vandermeer's handiwork. It's super duper detailed, has a lot of little notates, a couple of questions, things like that. Back side's Andy Misick. It's a little more trim the fat. It's for quick reference, kind of like on the way to a call, something like that. The importance is, these sheets are a living document, right? Like all our others, like all our load ratings and stuff like that. So we need contributions, we need deletions. So please, take the time to digest this stuff and give us your feedback on it as we go forward. Okay? So that's why we are here. I'm here specifically because I went to that class because I was intimidated by them. I gleaned some good stuff, and I wanted to help out and bring it in here. But mostly I have my own experience to look at, which is a lot of mistakes after going to a class and learning what I missed, right? I also learned this handy little chart 2 days ago, so that makes me an expert on it now. So I want to share it with you as a resident expert.
Just like we planned. I mean, come on, guys.
So, where I was when I showed up at class was on this side of the scale, at the peak of Mount Stupid. This side of the scale represents my confidence. Down here is my competence, okay? So I knew a few things. I know that I have run elevator calls and done fine. I've never had a catastrophic failure. I've never hurt anybody, never killed anybody, got away with a lot of things, right? So that puts me here feeling pretty good about the choices that I made. But I learned a little bit more, recognized how much error that was possible in my methods, and that slapped me down here to the valley of despair. And I think I'm sliding up here. I'm going to try to keep it in here. I'm not sure I'll ever reach this plateau of sustainability, because probably by the time I get there, I'll be ready to retire and elevators will be totally different, right? The point is, I don't want to be here again, right? This is where we were when we were attacking doors from the hinge side as our first move, and that's where I've operated a lot of my 16 years. Whether it's 4 dudes or 8 dudes showing up to an elevator call, we are crawling all over it, spider monkeys, doing a bunch of different things and not communicating, right? That's what I have experienced. I didn't know how to organize us because I've never been taught anything. I just knew I didn't like the way it felt. So that made me take an interest in it. So to get into the meat and the potatoes, our goal here is to cover progression, elevator progression, and then do a couple of hands-on, divide up in 2 teams, okay? 3 types of elevators, just for a little background: hydraulic, electronic traction, MRL. MRL and electronic traction are pretty much one and the same. It's just a matter of where that machine room is located. That machine room would be located in the hoistway rather than on top of or outside of it, right? So one and the same. We don't have time to talk about hydraulic. I drew one here, and there's one sitting out in the parking garage. It's a killer one to train on. These people are super accommodating, so if you're looking for a spot to train, use it. I drew 2 different roping methods for electronic traction elevators. I only drew those not because one is better than the other or because there are only two in existence. There's many. But what I want to drive home is that looking in a hoistway and looking at the redirects and anchors and what moves in an elevator hoistway, we're never going to remember all of them. So we have to have a process for sizing the equipment up and understanding what moves, because what moves is what's a hazard to us and to the people we're helping out, right? So there's many roping methods. Fortunately for us, this place is pretty simple, pretty clean. There's not a whole lot of noise, so when we get into the hoistway, it'll make some sense into us. The wide elevator stall, these are kind of the big reasons. Human error, that's as simple as somebody doesn't know how to push buttons, or somebody accidentally pushed an emergency stop, right? That happens. Equipment malfunction could be any number of things. I mean, pretty basic, we'll talk about what specifically could fail out there. Elevator safety's tripped. This is just for good example. While we were setting up elevators here on one of our occasions, we're trying to move a car, get it to where we want it to go. We can't quite figure out why it wasn't working. That's because the other station's working on the floor with hoistway doors open, right? They have it open and cracked and chalked, but it trips that mechanism, and we weren't able to move it, right? So that happened to us here. Power failure, obvious. Relays and switches, for example, moving all these cars around over the last couple of days. Somebody hits a stop safety to demonstrate best practice, forgets to remove it, then we're trying to move cars at the end of the day and we're jammed up for 30 minutes troubleshooting, right? So it's just like kind of something that can happen. Overload is a big one. This is a trickier scenario, and it's one of our most common, most common reasons why they fail. It's also one of the most dangerous and the places I think we're the most complacent. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. One of the first things we need to do is decide if we got an emergency, right? I mean, we do that all day, every day on the medical calls we go to. We look at the lift assist that's around the corner that we go to 3 times a week, and we decide how we want to go, right? But they gave us this acronym. I like it on one hand: fire, injury, illness, panic, FIP. I like it on one hand because it gives me some broad categories to categorize, like what type of emergency is this. On the other hand, I hate it because there's so much latitude and gray area, it's really not that helpful. Fire is pretty obvious, but injury, illness, panic, take any one of those situations and put them sitting on the couch at their home versus in an elevator shaft. The severity is different, right? So the point is, the size up of the emergency is up to us, right? It's not up to them. Right? We have to take the whole situation and decide how urgently do we need to move. That's where we start getting into some gray area with what is the best practice. What is the way we should do business? What does our policy say? Right? Well, our policy is under review kind of perpetually. We don't have any strict, clear guidance as of this moment. Best practice, where does that come from? Does it come from a person who runs a million calls but doesn't think about how they run them, or does that come from a guy like me that goes to one class, right? So we got to take all that information and decide what best practice is. The class we took from Mike Dragonetti, just a quick background on him. Dude was an elevator mechanic for 15 years prior to his fire service career. And then after that, he stayed tied into the industry. So he's been in the fire service 25 years. So he's got kind of both sides of the house covered from our perspective. Pretty handy person. He would never call himself an expert, but that's what everyone else would call him. So we can only take his information and put that in with the information we know to come up with best practice. That's more or less the progression sheet that you see in front of your face. That is part of what we glean from it. That said, this statement is on the top of every one of our policies, elevator policy included, right? This statement right here, you've read 100 times, 1,000 times, and you probably don't think too much when you read it. In fact, when you go to read policies and study, you probably skip it and move on to the meat and potatoes because you're so used to seeing it, you kind of stop reading it. It's kind of lost its meaning. To me, this is the most important phrase in our policy because it tells you that you can do whatever you want to do. You can. You just have to justify it, communicate it, right? And we do it all the time in all kinds of situations. But it's hairy right now because we all want a script for what do you want me to do on elevator calls? What and when. We want a perfect script on what we want. But we also want all the latitude to deviate, right? And how do you justify the deviation? How do you communicate the deviation? Is it just the result that dictates whether what you did was right or wrong? I don't really think so. So that's why I think we gotta get a solid progression down that can help you decide when deviation is a good idea, okay? When do we manually secure a car? This is the biggest piece for us because that's one of the biggest tools that we now have in our hands that we haven't been doing forever, right? I didn't manually secure a car for 15 and a half years, and I ran a good deal of elevator calls. So why do we got to start now, right? Well, I just got away with it, right? I've gotten away with a lot of things. But now we've learned some things, okay? These are the recommended reasons that you would secure an elevator car. Catastrophic failure. Is that a racked car? Is that a failed rail? Is that a lost rope? Is that a bad motor? All those things could be catastrophic depending on the circumstances of the call, right? Is the car on the ground floor? Is it weighted up into the top floor? How is it overloaded? Is it underloaded? Those are all things I take into account when I decide how bad the emergency is. But a catastrophic failure is one time that we would manually secure a car. Overloaded, let's dive down that wormhole just a little bit. We've gotten away with a lot of elevator calls for a long time where it's been overloaded. Put 15 frat boys in a 6-person car, right? They're full of beer, right? That car's overloaded. The car doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It goes somewhere in the balance, in the counterbalance system where it rests in its happy place. And we got people that are trapped. They're safe inside a box, but it's a counterbalance that's holding them there, right? That's what's holding them in place. We can take some safety to lock that system out without manually securing. But if one or any of those things don't work, and our plan is to hop on top of the car to pull them out the top, we could easily teeter that system to ride it down into the basement. And the guy who taught us the class, Mike Dragonetti, has a story of doing just that. Through his own complacency, getting on top of a car too soon, riding it to the basement. He didn't kill anyone, he didn't maim anyone, no one lost their career, but some guys got shook up and some guys got hurt, right? So that's a pretty serious situation and kind of drove home to me how I don't want to be too quick to add weight to the top of that car until we've really sized up what we're dealing with, right? I want to take in the whole situation within my size up progression and decide before I set foot on that car that I'm doing it with intent, okay? So that's a good overloaded scenario. Narrow space can be a little bit confusing. We're talking about, what you got? Yeah, man. We're talking about you're in a lobby, 10-foot pit below, it's a fall hazard, right? You've got a car that's not quite on the landing. I'm looking at the bottom of the car, eye level here. I've got a person inside that car, I want to bring them out of the car. This space is less than 3 feet, right? I've got a pit below, and that person is a fat body that's never done anything athletic in their life, or a 15-year-old drunk girl, right? One and the same. I can't trust them to squeeze through a narrow space safely. That's not the world they live in, right? They're safe inside that box, so we need to make that box as safe as possible, right? And I'm not talking about just a backboard underneath, but securing the car and making sure it's not going to go anywhere. One of the funner parts of the class was watching pretty gross videos of people getting folded by cars that moved unexpectedly, and that narrow space just should be a clue to us to anticipate what could happen if a car moved unexpectedly, okay? Time to slow down. Humans in the shaft or the pit. This is where we run into a lot of confrontation, spec ops and reg ops, right? Because we're humans, they're humans, we work in this environment, right? We work in high angle, we work in man and machine, we work in confined space. So we're used to all that stuff. But let's take somebody who doesn't work in that environment. They ride in elevator cars, they go eat at a restaurant, they stay in their apartment downtown, and that's about all they do, right? So let's talk about those people first, right? If our plan is to remove a person from the top hatch of a car, let's say the car is secure, car is safe, locked out, tagged out, nothing's going to move. If we're deciding to put a person in the hoistway to get out of a car, we need to consider their abilities as part of the equation, right? So we send a ladder down to the top of the car, we open the top of the car, we take a look at our people in there, and we have to make a call, like, can this person climb a ladder? Because every one of us is supposed to climb a ladder. If you fall off a ladder, you probably were doing something wrong, right? But you were within your scope. These people, it's not their scope, right? So let's think about that when we want to consider, do we need fall protection, fall arrest, stuff like that on those people? Do we have guardrails? Is there an adjacent car here that's blocking the gaping hole in the floor, right? So for those people, we need to consider that fact when we're deciding if this is a rope call or not. And that stuff's more in DJ's wheelhouse. But I want to talk more about when we put us in the hoistway and when we decide to work in that environment. So putting rail blocks on the car that I described earlier, 15 frat boys, right? Balance, but my weight is load on that car, that's a rope call before I put the rail block on, right? So it gets a little bit tricky on the equation. When we go into a hoistway, the recommendation is any type of work by us in a hoistway is locked out manually, right? That's inconvenient for a lot of people. It can be inconvenient for us, thanks man. That can be inconvenient for us, right? It's not about us trying to take work. I don't know about you guys, but I don't want to run more elevator calls. I'm good. I don't run a whole bunch of them, but I'm good with my numbers. So it's not about making something a specialty that doesn't need to be a specialty. But if we can offer a service that can make it a little bit safer, then I want to help with that. I don't want to wait for a day for us to have our own catastrophe in the hoistway, right? So if we're all on the same page with a progression, and if we decide that this car needs rail blocks or doesn't need rail blocks, we got to make that decision on our own. But if the industry standard says that you will lock it out if you're going to be person in the shift and you choose to deviate, you just got to know that, and you got to make that the decision with a total size up of the situation, right? Again, refer back to the earliest statement, right? You can do anything you want. You got to be accountable for it. You got to communicate it, right? You got to justify yourself, basically. Any doubt, you know what that means. Like, if three of us are looking at a elevator and we don't like what we see, we're not going to do it. You know, we're going to find a safer way. I have some tidbits here. They really don't matter. It's a little bit of support for some of the decisions, some of the size up stuff. It's not that important. This is the meat and potatoes. What is our progression, right? So this is your sheet. We're just going to breeze through it real quick before we get to work. Responding to a call, code 1 versus code 3, that's your call text information, that's your officer's discretion, that's what you're paid to do. So you got to decide based on the situation. Contact the caller and the building rep. I've not always been great at this. I'm getting better at it in a lot of call types. I don't like to be on the phone while I'm in the rig, so I pick up the phone, I call the call number, hand it to the back, tell them what the situation is, and they can talk to that person. It's important to talk to the caller because the caller may be standing inside a car, and I can say, what car are you in? They can look up and say, it's car number 7. In a large building, that helps me narrow my window of operation, right? I can talk to a building rep, and I can ask them, where's car 7? They can tell me southwest corner and I'm on site. I'll be standing outside the stairwell, or I'm 5 hours out. That's all information to help me make a decision, right? Checking the emergency plans, I'm even worse at this, right? Those are the new things on our MDC. It's hard for me with pickle fingers to dig through that stuff sometimes. It's hard for me to scan around and zoom in and out and glean the information that I want from the noise. But these are getting better. And this is particularly helpful with MRLs because mid-rise with an MRL may have a shutoff in a bizarre location. And if that information is in here, then I'm not going to spend time with 8 Bubbas wandering around looking for an unmarked closet, you know? If it's in there, what's that?
They're doing that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think what the code says specifically is the controls must be on an upper floor. And I don't think it clarifies beyond that, right? I can't speak to why that exists, but that's the situation. And there's tell of people finding them in an adjacent structure. Point is, some of that information is getting entered in here with the MRL specifically, so keep that in the back of your mind, you know? Maybe check that en route, okay? Our initial on-scene actions, we want to gather our equipment, our keys, we want to locate that rep, because if I can have my hand held somewhere, that's what I want to do. I don't want to wander around looking. So I locate that rep, get a mechanic responding. Here's why that matters. If you know that the mechanic is on site 5 minutes out or 5 hours out, you can factor that into your response time and decide, is this an emergency? So you can use that piece of information. And we don't want to call for them late. Those guys know their buildings, right? That's like their territory. We take pride in knowing our territory, knowing our equipment, same for them. That's not to say that some of them aren't idiots, right? And we have our own idiots. But they probably have some information that we don't, so it's a good starting point. Dividing the crew, Let's just talk single engine company, 2 and 2, that's nothing new for the most part. It's not necessarily what I've done for most of my career, but I think it's the way it should be done. The communication piece I think is pretty important here. Sending 2 to the machine room, 2 to the car to work on car access. Who are you gonna send where? You gotta think about that. It's my opinion that whoever's in charge should be going to the car and making the decisions there, right? And then send 2 other guys up top. FTAC, Direct 16, and Cell, all 3 forms of communication between the team, right? Because we can run into problems with both the FTAC and Direct 16. Cell phone solves most of them. I trend towards that, works in most buildings. I'm not broadcasting over the city, and I can talk frankly with you, you know? So I like the idea of having those forms of communication. And then within all that, we're somewhere in there, we're starting to determine what type of elevator we're dealing with and sizing up what can we do about it. Our on-scene actions, we got 2 teams early in the incident. And this is what we're gonna do today. Car access and motor room team. So on the car access team, you wanna locate the car. It's pretty simple. You wanna get in voice contact with some people. Where do you do that from, right? If the car is at a landing, I like the idea of just trying to crack the doors a little bit and talk through there to them. It's close to them, they could probably hear you best. What you're not getting is any intel about what the hoistway might look like, right? Going to the floor above, you'll probably get both of those things. You can probably yell down to them, and you can probably start sizing up your hoistway and looking at the anatomy and deciding how it's going to affect your call. When we're communicating with them, this is the kind of stuff we're communicating. We can ask them to do some things for self-rescue. Simple as, are the interior car doors closed? That's important to us because we probably can't troubleshoot that problem inside the elevator without being in there. All the other problems outside the elevator we're a little closer to than they are. So asking them to marry those doors, push them close together, that safety is a common failure point. And if they can do that, we might be able to fix a problem with phase 1. Okay, do that, now push door open, or do that, push ground floor, something like that. So coaching them through self-rescue. Emergency stop, we talked about that. Push buttons, we talked about that. Coach them through, push the door open, push ground floor, whatever the case is. And then decide if there's an emergency. That's our size up time for what's going on inside the car. So you got 2 people doing that. I'm recommending one of those people be whoever's in charge of the operation. Your motor room team, they're sizing up on the way up to the motor room. Nick Schroeder's gonna take you through that process at that station. You'll be doing this station with me and Bill Kessler. The motor room team, you're sizing up on the way in, like what do you look, listen, feel on the way in. If he's got fire in the motor room, smoke in the motor room, whatever, he can start communicating that stuff to me, and I can factor that into like my spidey sense is telling me what kind of direction I need to go to solve the problem. Checking the equipment, locating the disconnects, both the mainline disconnect and the car lights disconnect. Most of us know that those are separate. I think it's important to use them as a size-up function because in a room that doesn't have a marked set of disconnects, you have one big and one little, or maybe the numbers aren't mounted somewhere, you can use that as a investigative tool. So if I'm thinking that car 3 is this switch, I don't want to check with the mainline power. I want to check with the car lights, and I also want to communicate with people in the car. Like just say, hey, car lights might go out for a second, they're going to come right back on. But then we can identify, okay, that's the right one. Now we know which one is a mainline disconnect. They're probably pretty close together, okay? And then the main thing is reporting to IC what you got up there. All that size up, and then any actions you're prepared to do. Like, hey, I'm ready to disconnect power here. Whoever's downstairs can make that decision and say, yeah, go ahead and kill power if that's where they're at. But not doing that independently. Okay. When we decide we are going to remove an occupant from it, we ruled out, we're not going to wait for a mechanic because this is an emergency or he's 5 hours out, it's impractical, whatever the case is. So we're there, we can try the phase 1 thing. Usually doesn't work, but we need to go through that progression. Try phase 1, see if you can recall the elevators. That didn't work, so now we're on to cycle power. Cycling power is more than just on-off or off-on. Needs to spend some time in the off position. They recommend about 45 seconds. I saw from messing with these elevators yesterday, we had a little bit of trouble repositioning them, and my own impatience was the thing that caused the problem. I was waiting in the car, looking at the trouble numbers, and I didn't give it enough time to think after power came back on before I gave it a new command, right? So give it some time to cycle, do what it needs to do. If you don't get what you want out of that reboot, now's the time where power is going off and it's staying off. Okay, so that's our whole progression up to there to power off. And then the work starts, right? It's kind of an annoying thing to do, but without doing that stuff up until there, we're putting ourselves in a lot of hazard, okay? So we cycled power, we've decided to kill. Now it's time to open the hoistway and determine the car location for sure, because that starts our operation and whether we decide where we're gonna access from. Because it could be on the floor below, could be on the floor above. We haven't decided yet if this is a top hatch rescue. But really getting that intel and getting a thorough size up. You might have peeked in there already, but getting a thorough size up of the equipment and deciding what kind of call this is. Because right about this time, you're starting to know, man, is this a rope call? Is this a tech call? Or is this just a stalled elevator and a simple fix, right? So you're working through all that progression. We already talked about this stuff, but you're deciding now, do I need additional resources? What options do I have for removal? Bringing another car alongside it, what can I do? Once we've decided to remove the occupant and we've removed them, this is something I messed up too. We're not gonna restore power to an elevator that we killed power to. We're not gonna do that with a sprinkler system, right? We might screw a head in to stop the flow of water or restore some water, but we're not gonna give them the thumbs up on your system's good to go. And I've messed this up. I've decided to turn the elevator back on, let it go back in service, and 2 hours later, it was the same call type, same location, same situation. Even though, after we were done with the first round, we rode the elevator and operated properly, for the occupant later that evening, it didn't, right? So I created a call rather than fixing a call. And, I mean, I got away with it, right? Nobody got hurt, but I don't want to wait until somebody gets hurt to know if that was the right decision. When the power's off, we want to leave contact info and lockout tagout up there. Nick will go over that with you up there. One quick thing I want to mention too, on 2 occasions, I have started messing with elevators and then learned that there were elevator mechanics on site working. Once was at a mid-rise on scene, kind of sound like your normal BS elevator call, through the hoistway, all that stuff, nobody's there, kill power, and then we find elevator mechanic a few floors up on an adjacent car, right? So we needed to be more thorough with that call before we started moving anything. Thankfully, we didn't move anything, and if he locked out properly, it would have been fine. But the point is, thorough investigation on the front end before you start doing anything. Another occasion was yesterday morning when I arrived here. Nick's job was to go up to the roof at the end of the day, secure some stuff. He did that, he locked it all up, he came down. The next morning I show up and shit's different. The lock is off, it's laying on the roof, the door's closed. Go up to the elevator machine room, looks to be normal, but there's a couple things that are different. There's some panel doors open. This doesn't look right. What's the deal here? So before doing anything, before going, because my first thought was, well, Nick's an asshole. I asked him if he locked up, and he said yes, and he didn't. That's super upsetting to me. He's a liar. But called the building rep and said, hey man, have you guys had an elevator guy out here? And he said, not that I'm aware of, and we were talking through this. I said, here's what my concern was. Things are different than when I left them last night. And while we're talking, elevator mechanic pulls up out front, parks his truck, gets out with his Schlotsky sandwich or whatever, He had been here for routine maintenance. He knew nothing about our class, and he wasn't here because we broke anything. He was here because they have a trouble car here, right? So I could have gone in there and started flipping switches and moving cars with the confidence that, hey man, I know this place, right? On the peak of Mount Stupid. But I slowed down and said, okay, I'm gonna investigate this fully. So there's a couple of occasions where elevator mechanics have we're operating in their world, and we've showed up to, and it could have ended differently, okay? So that's it for in here. The next thing we're gonna do is divide up into